Just imagine finishing your custom dream home and you've decided to put a basement in, and just a few months later, there's a big storm, tons of raindrops, and all of a sudden, you now have leaks. As I've said over and over again, in our current basement build, you have one shot to be able to get what's underground done correctly. And today we're gonna talk about waterproofing details and why they're so pertinent to any home that's getting a basement installed below grade. Let's get to it. So what's your first defense of making sure that water isn't permeating or penetrating through your basement walls? Well, that's gonna be your elastomeric liquid membrane that you see right here. And ultimately, as we are here on our footer, you can see this elastomeric coating has a mesh tape that's included to be able to ensure that we have proper adhesion and proper coverage within our joint. And we're gonna talk a little bit about that in a second of how important that is. But one of the reasons that I mentioned that this is the first defense against it is there are some nuances where sometimes there's off-gassing or there's a few items that your builder needs to be in tune with to ensure that you are able to have the maximum benefit from the elastomeric coating. So I'm gonna go show you a detail on the actual wall before we get to what this scratch coat is right here. Let's go over here and take a peek. Soon after we completed our mesh application and our portion of what needed to be waterproofed on the footing, we soon moved to a small portion of our basement wall to be able to apply that elastomeric coating. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have used cleaning products or other things that have a warning on them that says, utilize it in a small inconspicuous place before, applying it across the board. And that would be for any cleaning solution on, like, let's say a marble countertop to a wood floor to tile application. That's something that our waterproofing company finds very important, is that they want to actually test a small portion. And so they took about a 10-foot section of this wall to be able to see how the membrane would coat the overall finished concrete that was placed just a couple weeks ago. And one of the things that they noted were some of these pockets. I think a lot of people think of concrete as being impermeable, but it actually can soak water up like a sponge. And so in testing this small 10-foot section, we realized that there was enough voids and potential for off-gassing of the concrete that was placed that we wanted to reach out to the manufacturer to ensure that we had proper adhesion and proper coverage to ensure that this wall would be impermeable and that we wouldn't have water moving or traveling through the wall and into our basement cavity, where we'll have an outdoor patio as well as interior structure of the home. So after being on the phone and reviewing the manufacturer's guidelines, they recommended that in a specific application, if we had any concerns with the overall air pockets that might reside on the exterior of this basement wall, that we could use a two-part solution where we meld two products together. And ultimately, that's where our scratch coat came into place. It's a mortar-based scratch coat that has some waterproofing properties, but the reality is it isn't totally impermeable. And the reason that we opted to do this is because it actually helps to fill any voids and give us a nice rough texture to be able to apply our 70 mil thickness of elastomeric coating on top. And what that really does is it allows us to be able to have a better surface for adhesion as well as for coverage that allows us to be able to ensure that there's no air pockets or gaps that might occur, which could be very problematic in the future with any leakage within the basement. So after extensively reviewing this with the manufacturer's rep, I don't think we'll ever build a basement without this secondary layer of protection, which really allows us to do exactly what the product is meant to do, which is to fully encapsulate the area in which dirt will reside and water will travel through the soil to be coated appropriately so that we won't be deal with leaking during the complete and total lifespan of this home. So at this point in the video, I find it really beneficial to talk a little bit more about the importance of this scratch coat layer. And that really goes back to the assembly of the basement wall structure. I think a lot of people look at this as a solid structure, a wall that's impermeable. When you really look at how a basement is constructed, we have our footing that has a ton of rebar in place, and then we have rebar that's sticking out of that footing to be able to capture the wall and be able to tie the two pieces together to make it structurally significant, to be able to hold all of the weight that's associated with the backfill. And and to hold the weight of the structure above it. But one of the things that's often overlooked is the fact that we do have a critical seam here where we have a cured piece of concrete in the footing, and then we're pouring or placing that concrete basement wall on top of that. And so there's actually a void. There's actually, concrete doesn't immediately bond to one another. In fact, that is a potential cracking point. And so that's why it's important for us to get our mesh detail in here so that we're able to fill that void and ensure that we have full adhesion with our elastomeric coating. We also have anchor bolts that protrude into the basement wall from the interior of the house. And we also have all of our clips that are able to hold that basement wall forms in place that we actually cut off appropriately throughout the whole property. However, this would be a point of intrusion that could occur at any of these points, which there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these around the overall structure. So the additional benefit of the scratch coat also allows for us to be able to have a smooth texture. So if you see here, it covers any of those imperfections. It helps to cover any of the gaps where our form boards were placed, and really allows us to be able to achieve the desired outcome, which is a fully waterproofed home. Now, this is where a lot of people will stop and say, hey, we've done a good enough job. We've now gone ahead and applied our liquid membrane, so we're good to backfill. And I would say that they need to slow down a little bit and think about some of the other things that might occur that could create leakage within the overall cavity of the basement space. So now I want to talk about drainage board and why that's so important for this specific basement detail. So drainage board, sometimes called dimple board, is used both in commercial applications for retaining walls. It's used a lot in the landscape arena to make sure that there's not root intrusion that would push out that wall or essentially compromise it in the future. Well, similarly, we're going to have landscaping around the property, which could provide problems for root intrusion, although we'll try to minimize that by not having too many trees too close to the house. But one of the big items that we will be dealing with is hydrostatic pressure of that soil, sometimes being saturated, even here in the desert when we have monsoons, being saturated and just water residing on the overall membrane. That's why we've created our dimple board application. First and foremost, is to allow for proper drainage to occur and to ensure that there's essentially an air gap that's between the overall structure of the basement and the soil that resides just outside of it. And that dimple board application or drainage mat is essentially a poly product that has a felt screen on it that allows for proper drainage to occur and for fine molecule dirt not to clog up your drainage within that overall mat system. So a lot of builders will just stop at a liquid membrane, but in my opinion, that's not enough to be able to ensure that we have an impermeable wall. So our second detail is going to be a drainage mat, and there's three main reasons why we're going to use a drainage mat. The first is going to be protection of the wall. We essentially have about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch thick drainage mat that's a polystyrene base with a filter fabric or a felt filter fabric over it. And what that's going to do is once we've actually coated this in our liquid membrane, we're going to protect that, so as we backfill and compact, it will help to ensure that there's no damage done to the wall. I mean, if we had a large rock, and we have, here in Arizona with our desert landscape, we have a lot of harsh conditions in our soil. And so, if we were to backfill this and let's say it took a chunk out of here because there was some big boulders or rocks that are essentially in that backfill, ultimately that could create a problem compromising the wall. But the second item is going to be the hydrostatic pressure. If we didn't have a drainage mat on here, essentially the soil would just sit directly onto our liquid membrane, and when a huge monsoon would come through, we'd have saturation in that soil, and that saturated soil, as it worked its way down into the water table, is just going to be sitting up against this wall. And because of that, it's going to have constant pressure from that water that could essentially work its way into a void or a crack or a hole and allow it to be able to penetrate into the interior portion of our basement. And then the third piece of that is going to be the appropriate drainage. Because it looks kind of like an egg carton, it keeps an air gap in place, and then after that water passes through the soil and through the fabric, it actually travels past any voids or imperfections in the wall and gets all the way down to our French drain system, which we'll talk about here next. So before we move on to our actual French drain assembly, this is what the finished product looks like. You see obviously much less voids in the overall product. We've decided to coat it with a 70 mil, and to do that we do a 2-roll application, although we're gonna bring a sprayer in place as well to be able to get a final coat on there. So we're gonna roll first and then we're gonna spray for the second time to be able to speed things up and also make sure that we have a consistent layer throughout. You know, imagine that we have our dimple board application on here, which is once again about a 1/2 inch, I think it's 5/8 inch thick material. And then what's that gonna do is it's gonna allow for all that water to travel down to our overall footing basin. And the architect has smartly called out for a 4-inch rigid pipe that's a perforated to be able to reside at the footing level. And they want us to have essentially 18 inches of rock fill up to the pipe and then 18 inches of rock up above the pipe. And so ultimately we have about 36 inches of a French drain with large 1-inch rock fill with a 4-inch perf pipe that runs the perimeter of the home, allowing for that water to reside in this French drain and in a flood event actually fill up the cavity to a point where it can run through that perforated pipe that will run the whole perimeter of our basement. So where exactly does that water go? Well, we have a drainage sump, and as I mentioned, we have a 1,200 square foot walkout patio inside. And so prior to placing our concrete, we went ahead and we created a 6-inch conduit. We have 2 of them here and 2 of them on the other side, which will allow us to be able to get that 4-inch pipe through unimpeded and also meeting code by having the conduit 2 sizes larger, so 6-inch versus the 4-inch drainage pipe that's called out is critical so that there's no pressure, you're never gonna crack that pipe, and it's gonna stand the test of time so that you'll never have to replace it. And I think that's the key. You know, we're sitting down here in a hole about 12 feet underground, and it will be underground. The reality is you don't want that expensive a fix or a warranty issue to happen on your build or your custom home. You want it done right the first time, and you need to pay the appropriate amount of money to be able to ensure that you have a solid system working in your favor. Anyways, with that said, we're gonna go through here and we're gonna go to our drainage sump. So let's go check out inside so that we could talk about how we're able to get that water out of the basement cavity and pumped appropriately up to our final grade, allowing for that water to then eventually travel out to the street and into the city drainage plan. Now we're sitting inside our basement cavity. Now, on the inside of our basement, we have obviously our interior structure. So we'll have framing for a 9-foot top plate and trusses. We have a covered patio that's down here. So about 1,500 square feet of it is interior living space, and about 1,200 square feet of it is outdoor patio space. Some is open air patio space, and others and other portion of it is covered patio space. But nonetheless, in this area we have a big planter that's going in place, and so we've went ahead and preemptively put a 24-inch catch basin in here, and there's actually fill rock another 6 feet down within this cavity, because in a monsoon where there's a lot of watershed, we don't want our outdoor patio to flood, and so we actually created additional drainage so that if the sump ever failed, we would have plenty of time to be able to get it back up and running. But neither here nor there. Here's our 2 conduits, and we have a 4-inch pipe here. This isn't a perf pipe, but ultimately that 4-inch pipe will pop through and it will reside here into our catch basin and our drainage sump, and then that sump will then pump that water through a 2-inch pipe that will go through and travel through a 4-inch conduit that we have here, and then it will take it out to our grading and drainage plan, which will allow it to be able to appropriately exit the property to ensure this house will never flood and never leak. For any questions or information regarding some of the products that we might use in waterproofing, please DM us. And if you like the content, we appreciate you clicking that button below and subscribing to our channel to be able to keep up to date with all of the building that's taking place here within our company in Phoenix. We appreciate you following along, and as always, have a great day.